profesor muy distinguido. Tenemos la suerte de que hoy esté aquí después de un intento. Lo íbamos a tener en septiembre, pero él tuvo problemas y ya no pudo viajar. Voy a hacer solamente algo muy corto porque él quiere que sea algo corto. Y solamente les quiero decir que el doctor Concaine es un profesor muy distinguido que cuenta con alrededor de 315 publicaciones, pero eso no es lo más relevante tal vez para él. Es una persona que ha estado involucrado en una gran cantidad de comités científicos y académicos, y entre ellos el comité de selección de premios Nobel. Sigue estando en esta parte y de hecho de lo que nos va a estar hablando hoy. Esencialmente el doctor ha estado trabajando en problemas relacionados con el estilo de proteínas hacia la membrana, un poco sobre su estructura, biogénesis.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to come here. I'm sorry I couldn't make it a couple of months ago. All the much better. I feel all the much better to be able to come now. Also, it's my first time in Mexico City, and I've always wanted to see, the university library in real life. And yesterday I had a chance to do it, and that's really something, something out of the ordinary, really amazing. So thank you again for the invitation, and since I have some experience from awarding Nobel Prizes, I thought I would like to share with you, a bit about the Nobel Prize in chemistry in my particular case. First, giving you some background, some history of the prize, how it came into being, and basically how it's working. And then I'd like to tell you a bit about the actual work that's being done within the committees that are responsible for these prizes. What's the process like? What's the thinking like in these committees? And I hope you'll find it of some interest. So, of course, the Nobel Prize starts with the man himself, Alfred Nobel. This is a picture of him as a young man. Of course, he grew older with time, and this is perhaps a more well-known type of image of him when he came towards the end of his life. So he was born in Sweden in 1833, and he died in 1896 in Italy. And note that he died on December 10th, 1896, and that's the reason why the Nobel Prize ceremony is held on December 10th every year, so it's basically his death day. He died in Italy, not in Sweden, and that's significant because he was a very international person. So he grew up in Sweden, but he spent a good part of his life in other parts of the world. In Russia, a long time in France, and of course in Italy. So he was really an internationalist, which is also reflected actually in the prize, as you will see. He became rich. Well, he came from a kind of entrepreneurial industrial family. His father, I think, had mechanical workshops, I think in Finland and Sweden. One of his brothers was actually the pioneer who started the oil industry in Russia, in Baku. So he had a brother that started Nobel Oil, I think it was called, or some, starting to exploit the oil findings in Russia. And he himself was more of a chemist. And he made his money basically from working with explosives. And his most important discovery was dynamite. Okay, so I think we still use dynamite, or people still use dynamite in construction work and other places. And of course, in those days, nitroglycerin was already known to be a highly explosive compound, but it was very hard to use because it was so easy to ignite it. So you just dropped something on the container and the whole thing would blow up. So it wasn't very useful, or if you used it, it was very dangerous. And he actually found out himself because he had a laboratory and a small factory in Stockholm, which actually blew up at one point because of the nitroglycerin. He himself survived, but I think it was again another brother that died in fact there. But his big invention was to mix nitroglycerin with this stuff here, which I think is some sort of kieselguhr. It's something you can extract from mines, I think. And what he discovered was that if he mixed nitroglycerin with this sort of absorbent kieselguhr, he got something which you could really do anything to. You could hit it with a hammer, and you could, put fire underneath it and so on, and it would not explode. And it was also quite malleable, so you could make it into any kind of shape you wanted. It was like a dowel, basically. But you could make it explode if you had a special detonator that he also invented, inserted into this mixture. So then suddenly dynamite was invented. He patented it in 1867. And this now meant that suddenly you had the power of nitroglycerin, but you could use it very safely in construction work, and of course also for military purposes. And this became a big success, and he built factories across the world, not only in Europe, but in the United States and elsewhere. And he became very wealthy, running these Nobel factories to produce explosives, both for military and civilian purposes. By the time he died in 1896, he was, not the richest man in the world, but he was really quite wealthy. The state to a scientific prize. And here is, part of the will he wrote. It's actually written in Swedish, but so this is really the basis for the Nobel Prize. It's the will of Alfred Nobel. And if you work in the Nobel committees, now and then we kind of tend to go back to the will to make sure that the thinking of the committee is in accordance with what is stipulated in his will. So of course this is unchangeable, this is really what he wanted. Interpret what he meant in his will, and this way of interpreting what he meant has maybe changed slightly over time. But the basic words you cannot change. So what he wrote, and I'm just excerpting the most important things here for the prize itself, was that he said that the prize should go to those who during the preceding year shall have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind, those scientists that have done that. And so already here, it says the preceding year. So really what, he said, you should look at what happened last year, and you should find the contribution from last year. Of course, from the very beginning, the committees ignored this, I would say, or interpreted this in a way such that you could ignore it. Then you have this greatest benefit on mankind, which of course is a lot of different interpretations. What do you mean by that? So he said, to those who during the preceding year shall have conferred the greatest benefit on mankind, one part to the person who shall have made the most important discovery or invention within the field of physics. So that's the physics prize. One part to the person who shall have made the most important discovery or improvement. So that's the chemistry prize. and one part to the person who should have made the most important discovery within the domain of physiology or medicine. That's the prize in physiology or medicine. Then, of course, you have the Peace Prize and the prize in literature that was also stipulated in the will, but I'm just going to talk about the science prizes here. Now, so this is quite interesting, and I would say, that you see he actually used different words to describe physics, chemistry, and medicine, right? So he says for physics, it should be the most important discovery or invention, right? So an invention can receive a prize in physics, and of course, like this year, you know, with the LED lights, that's a clear invention, right? But other times, last year, the Higgs boson. So it's not an invention in chemistry, it's an improvement. And usually the new methods or even improvements in old methods, all right? But also discoveries, of course. And then for medicine or physiology, it's only. So they should really only concentrate on discoveries. Although sometimes they also have methodologies, you know, magnetic imaging, for instance, and things like that. But then they have to phrase it in such a way that it's phrased as a discovery. And finally, and this is also a very important thing that he wrote, no consideration be given to the nationality of the candidates. And this was extremely important for really establishing the Nobel Prize, you know, in the early years, because it was really the first scientific prize that had this international scope. There were certainly big prizes, you know, handed out by the Royal Academy in England and the French Academy and so on, but they were national prizes. They were for a British person or for a French, but not international prizes. So this was really the first one. Plus, in those days, it was a lot of money. You know, it was a big prize. But I think more important than the money is actually this thing, that it was the first truly international prize, where it says you cannot, when you award this prize, you cannot think about the nationality of the person you give it to. So this is why I think it became, this tiny little thing here is what really made it such a big, you know, gave it such a big importance over the history. So that's the will. Of course, the family was not very happy with this because all the money went somewhere else, and so there was a protracted fight over it actually. But even before even before that legal fight broke out, there was certain problems involved because he died in Italy. He had lived in Paris for I think 18 years before he died. So all his papers, all his assets were in French banks. Like all the in those days it wasn't on the internet, it was on computers, it was papers, right? And they were all in French banks. Now he actually, in his will, he said that the executor of the will should be this young man here, who was a collaborator, a young engineer called Sulman, who was a collaborator of Nobel, and he said he should be the executor. And what this guy did, he realized immediately that the fact that everything was stored in French banks was a problem. So what he did, almost the day after Nobel died, when he found out about the will, was he took the will, showing that he was entitled to run the estate, and he went to the banks and he took out everything, all the stuff that was in the banks. He put them in big crates, and he immediately put them on a train, and shipped them off to Sweden before the French authorities even realized what was happening. And this turned out to be really fortunate for Sweden, at least, because there was also a fight later on whether the prize should be handled by French authorities or by authorities. And I just learned the other day, in fact, that so there was apparently some sort of legal dealings between the two governments, and one important reason why finally it was decided that yes, this could be handled by Sweden was that, so the question was, where was he really living? Was he living in France or in Sweden? And then they apparently found out that he had his horse carriage, which was a very modern horse carriage for the day, for that time, was actually in Sweden. So he had, he had a house in a small town in Sweden, and that's where the horse carriage was. And somehow that carried some legal weight to argue that he was actually living in Sweden, because obviously you must live where your horse carriage is, right? So, so there was, so basically, thanks to this guy, all his assets came to Sweden very quickly, and thanks to the horse carriage, they also took care of the French the French arguments. But the family was still opposed to the prize, and so they had to, carry out a long negotiation with the family to finally come to an agreement. And I think the family in the settlement actually got a little money, but most of the money went to the prize. There was another problem as well, and that was that in the will he said that the prize should be awarded by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences for the physics and chemistry prizes, and by the Karolinska Institute, which is the medical university in Stockholm, as you probably know, for the medicine physiology prize. And neither of these two institutions were very keen to take on this job initially, and they said, why should we put work into a prize that's going to the world and not to us? And they were saying, how do we really have the expertise to do it? And they were really reluctant. So again, this guy Sulman had to negotiate for a number of years, actually, both with the family, but also with the Academy of Sciences and the Karolinska Institute, before he could finally get the package together and make them accept to take on this job, which they did, of course, fortunately. So although he died in 1896, the first prize was awarded only in 1901. So it took about 5 years to get everything settled and all the legal dealings done and the Nobel Foundation set up and so on. But he did manage, and he got the foundation set up. So there is a second piece of paper that's important for the committees when we do our work, and that's the statutes of the Nobel Foundation. Now, they are not totally written in stone. The will, of course, we cannot change, but these statutes in principle can be changed, but it's a very laborious process. So it's only happened a few times. And the last one is, I think, from 1994 or something like that. And in the statutes, there were some extra additional rules put in that, Nobel had not thought of. And so there are a number of stipulations that are in the statutes that relate to the prize itself. So, for instance, it says that the work that's rewarded must have appeared in print, or nowadays on electronic journals. But, it's not enough that somebody comes in and say, hey, I thought of this, 10 years ago. If it's not in print, forget it, okay? I think from a couple of times there has been a debate whether a poster presented at a scientific meeting can be considered in print. And I'm not quite sure what the actual resolution was, but I think possibly it can be. But it has to be documented somehow that it was really shown and people saw it and so on. A given prize, say in chemistry, a given year can be split at most into two parts. So you can actually combine two discoveries, or that don't have to be really related. Most of the time that doesn't happen, but sometimes it does. That can be at most 3 laureates in a given prize in a given year. And this, of course, is, people say, oh, if we had 4, we could have included that person and so on. I think 3 is a very wise choice, actually, because it just makes it even more complicated if you have more. Because usually there's or possibly 3 people where you can really see that this was the pioneering thing. But if you go down 4, 5, 6, then of course, the difference between the different people becomes smaller and smaller. So 3, I think, is a good choice, in fact. It would not be any easier if there were 4 allowed. Then there are some other specifications, like the laureates must have been nominated, and I'll come back to that, before the 1st of February, the same year that the prize is awarded. this is important for us that work in this process. All documents are to be kept secret for 50 years. So I'm not allowed to, to tell you sort of the internal discussions, about the internal discussions in the committee, for instance. And every documents that are generated during this process are kept under lock and key for 50 years. And after 50 years, scholars can ask to come see them, and historians and so on. And this is, the most important, effect of this is that we can tell when we ask people outside the committee to help us with reviews or with, with reviews of certain areas and so on. We can tell them, you can be confident that, everybody you write about will be dead by the time your report can be read by anybody, right? So normally nowadays the committees are maybe 7, 8, 9 people, something like that. And not necessarily Swedish, although in practice it turns out it's very rare to have people on these committees that are not Swedish. And I think that's actually facilitates work, because if we could take, just people from anywhere in the world, and you were on the committee, you'd feel kind of obliged to represent Mexico and promote maybe Mexican scientists and so on. If we're all Swedish, it's a lot easier, because then it's only one country represented, and in fact I think it's true to say that it's more difficult for a Swedish scientist to get the prize than for any other kind of nationality, because we'd be so careful and really scrutinize that person so much that, but it happens clearly. Okay, so that's what you have in the foundations of the Nobel Foundation, or in the statutes of the Nobel Foundation. So this is really what guides the work. It's the will and it's the statutes. And then, of course, the tradition that has developed over more than 100 years within the committees on really how to think about these things and how to reason about them and so on. So the first prizes were awarded in 1901, and the science prizes went to Röntgen for the discovery of X-rays, Van 't Hoff, who figured out chemical dynamics and osmotic pressure, and in medicine, von Behring for immune serum therapy. And these turned out, the first few years were really important, because they settled the kind of the level of the prize. And the people who were responsible at the time were really good in picking, the absolute top scientists at the time that had really made super important discoveries. And this really helped settle, to establish the prize in the scientific mind, so to say. And then, of course, there have been, almost every year, except for a couple of years during the First and Second World Wars, prizes have been awarded. And during the wars, they were also accumulated. Some of the prizes were actually accumulated. So after the war, there were more than one years. And for chemistry, I'm just, to remind you, I'm just picking out a few from the long list. So the first one was Van 't Hoff, and then Fischer got it the next year, sugar and purine chemistry. Arrhenius, the prize, so the Arrhenius plot, I'm sure. That's not what he got the prize for. He got the prize for his theory of electrolytes. So he was the first to to suggest that electrolytes were individual ions of different charge, plus and minus, that were moving about in a solution. So he developed that theory while he was still a PhD student, in fact. But in those days, your PhD went on for 10 years or something like that. So Rutherford, chemistry of radioactive substances. Curie, of course, Marie Curie. Langmuir, surface chemistry. Linus Pauling, nature of the chemical bond. And Pauling, of course, also got the Peace Prize. So he's a double laureate. Fred Sanger, sequencing of proteins, sequencing of DNA. I believe he's still the only person that has received 2 Nobel Prizes in chemistry. And so I just heard a story that when John Walker got the prize, they were celebrating at the MRC, and Fred Sanger came in and he said, "Well, come back when you have 2, then we can talk." Perutz and Kenru, protein crystallography, protein folding and 72, the chemiosmotic theory, of course, with Peter. Discovery of ribozymes, PCR, which of course is a pure methods prize. And a few years ago, structure of the ribosome to Ramakrishnan, Stites and Jonas. So this is just, my own personal pick from this long list of prizes. Of course, they have gone to, different countries, if you want to look at countries. Nobel said we should not, but still, people do the statistics. And I think what's quite interesting is, and understandable, of course, is the shift from a prize that was totally dominated by European scientists, so Europe is the blue sector here, up until the Second World War. And then, of course, it all shifted. And basically, this is mostly Germany, I would say, but also France, of course, and the UK. But at least initially, it was really Germany dominating prizes. And then after the Second World War, it shifted across the Atlantic to North America, which, of course, in the later years has been really dominating. And what we see now in the last, couple of decades is, or the last decade, I would say, is that Asia is starting to get more prizes now. At least so far, Japan, in fact. So that's what that's what it looks like if you look at where prizes go. I guess in Mexico, it's, I think this is the only Mexican-born person who got the chemistry prize, right? Yeah. Although there is also a Peace Prize and a Literature Prize, I think, that went to Mexico. This was a year or two before I joined the committee, so I wasn't involved in this prize, but of course that was an important prize with the ozone hole, which is actually healing now, I think. So the ozone hole is not as bad anymore. So that was really important that it was discovered at that time. One statistics that looks quite bad with modern eyes is if you say men versus women. So this is chemistry prizes. There's only 4 women that have the chemistry prize over the years. But including this year, 159 men. So this will, slowly grow probably, but it takes a long time. Physics, I think, might even be lower. But medicine and physiology, of course, is already quite a bit better when it comes to female prize winners. And if you go to literature, of course, it's much better. So this year, as you may remember, the prize was awarded for the development of super resolved fluorescence microscope. And I thought this was kind of a nice prize because it's a combination of chemistry, physics, and the applications are in biology. So it, in a kind of encompasses all, breadth of natural science in a way. So we're looking forward to receiving these people in, greeting these people in Stockholm in a few weeks now. And for next year, I couldn't even guess. It's kind of interesting. You're on the committee, and it's only sort of late spring, early summer that you start to get a sense of which is the prize going to be. Of course, we have a list of potential that we work with, but I couldn't tell you today what's the most likely one to get the prize next year. But if you go on October 7th, I think will be the date next year when it's going to be made official. So, and you can watch it, of course, live on the Nobel Prize site if you want. So that's kind of the history of the prize, bringing us up to this year. But what about the process itself? What do we do when we work in a Nobel committee? So the chemistry and physics prizes, as I told you, are handled by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences with this imposing building in Stockholm. And the medicine prize is done by the Karolinska Institute then, but the process is quite similar also in their case. So there are committees, one for chemistry, one for physics. I took this picture only 2 weeks ago at our last meeting. latest meeting. So we're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I took the pictures on 9. So 9 people in the committee this year. I think next year will only be 8 actually, because some people are rotating off. So the committee is, it's a substantial amount of work actually to be on the committee. On the other hand, if you're asked to be in the committee as a Swedish scientist, there is no way you could refuse to do it. You know, this is something you have to do, and it's actually a great fun to do it. So what do we do? Well, in February, just after the nominations have come in, we sort through the nominations, and you know, we look at our old lists of nominations, and you know, do we see any trends? Are there some scientists that or fields that suddenly get more nominations than we saw before, or are there some that are dropping off the list, not so interesting to people? So we try to do some trend spotting. Throughout the year, we discuss various, you know, different possible prize-worthy areas. And one way that we learn more about these areas is we commission reports. We commission scientists around the world actually to write reports for us. Either very general reports where we just ask about a whole field and what would they say were the most important discoveries in this field and who were the most important people. We worked for a while on a given field. We usually come down to more specific questions about, you know, what did this person precisely do at that time, and was anybody, you know, present in the lab and can tell us about from the inside what was going on, and so on. So we ask for more specific reports, and all maybe 20, 30 of these reports per year in all different, you know, different areas. We also have hearings with a few select kind of experts from outside. It varies a bit, but those are when, you know, we're getting really close to a potential prize. Then we usually ask maybe somebody who wrote a report for us that we really thought was a very good one. We ask them to come to one of our meetings, and we discuss with them for an hour or two. And then we know ourselves quite well what we want to ask them, what the critical issues are. So they can be quite helpful, these hearings. And then we write summaries. And finally, we write a rather big report to the Academy each year, where we describe all the work we've done and all the discussions we've had, and you know how we view different possible prizes, different fields. And finally, we end that report with a recommendation to the Academy that we think that this year, this particular prize should be awarded to these particular people. But it's not up to us to decide, of course, on who's finally going to get them. So a typical year would look something like this, where M stands for a committee meeting. So you see we have 8 to 10 meetings per year. They can be either 1 day or sometimes 2 days. So one spends quite a substantial amount of time. When I was chairman, I figured I probably spent the equivalent to maybe 2 months a year on this. And the other committee members spend, you know, almost the same amount. So it's quite a lot of work going into this. But everybody's very dedicated and very, you know, enthusiastic about doing the work. And it's the top priority meeting for everyone. It's basically impossible not to go to one of these meetings. So I'm just spending a month in New York, and of course we had a meeting a couple of weeks ago in November, and of course I had to fly back for the meeting. So you cannot not come. So you see, we work with the nominations and so on. We have discussion meetings. We actually have a joint committee meetings with the physics and medicine committees once a year, just to compare notes. And sometimes we get good advice, you know, good input from the other committees, and we also want to make sure that we're not giving the same prize to the same people one particular year, right? Although it's an interesting aspect of this is that, of course, there are certain prizes that could have been awarded, say, in medicine or chemistry, or in chemistry or physics, or even medicine or physics. But at the end of the day, it's only one committee that's going to take that prize. And it can actually make a difference as to who is going to be included in the prize if it's handled by medicine or chemistry, let's say. Because for chemistry, we worry more about the chemical basis for a discovery. molecular basis, let's say, whereas chemistry, or whereas medicine could perhaps look more from a kind of clinical side or something. So even though we would award the same area, we might or might not come up with different set of people and a different argument around the price as to what's being rewarded, in fact. So these are kind of interesting discussions between the committees. And then we work. This is where we essentially decide what our recommendation is going to be that year. And then we work throughout the summer on the report, and we send the report to the Academy here in early September. And then it's discussed first in our case, in the chemistry class in the Academy, which is some 20 people. And then the chemistry class sends it on to the full Academy. And in October, the full Academy meets and votes on the proposal for first the physics prize and the next day the chemistry prize. So this is really, the vote is really taken by the whole Academy. So the Academy makes the decision. So nominations are important, as you could see, because if you're nominated, you may be as good a scientist as as you wish, but you cannot be given the prize that year. So we have to get these nominations in. So how do we get them? Well, letters are sent out in early fall to all Swedish and foreign members of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, to the members, of course, of the Nobel committees, insofar as they're not members of the Academy, all previous Nobel laureates that are still alive, but most importantly are these remaining people here. So permanent and assistant professors in the science of chemistry at universities and institutes of technology in the Nordic countries, you could say. So they always get, if you're a chemistry professor in Norway, say, every year you'll get invited to nominate people for the Nobel Prize. Then there is a rotating list of international universities, quite a long list, and it's much more than 6, where a given year, a given university comes up, and then all the chemistry professors in that university would be invited to nominate, for instance, and this then rotates. So this could be anywhere in the world, basically. And finally, and this is the most important one actually, other scientists from whom the Academy may see fit to invite proposals. So this is when people in the Academy feel that this person really has a fantastic overview and we really trust, or I really trust the views of this particular person, so I want to invite this person to nominate. And this is a rather long list, and especially from this selection, a very high percentage of people we ask actually do provide nominations. Whereas if you go to some of these other lists, it's a return, I would say. But this really, we get very good feedback and return from this one. So this is a long list, which of course is developing over time, but it really gives us a lot of very good nominations. You cannot just nominate without having been invited to nominate, so you have to be invited, basically. Well, you can, but they will be just put to the side. So we put all the nominations together. This is only, well, this is basically another volume that we produce. Roughly, we tend to get about we send out about 3,000 invitations across the world to nominate. We usually get about 300 nominees out of these nominations, so not everyone replies, of course. Have on the list a suggested, usually around 300. And in the end, we have to filter this down to maximum of 3 laureates, right? So, and of course, if you look at who is nominated, how many times, it's quite different. So there's usually a few which are very, relatively highly nominated, and then there's a long tail of names that only get one nomination from somebody out there. So this is really the input, in a way, the formal input to the process. We can only think about awarding people that are in this book, basically. So what then are the criteria that the guys when we discuss these things? Well, of course, it has to be a groundbreaking discovery, or as I showed you in the will. Another way to is that we're looking for discoveries that open doors, open a new field of inquiry, or a methodology that suddenly makes it possible to do a lot of things that we couldn't do before. So we're looking for these unique singular inventions, and it says the discovery or invention, right? Not lifetime, it's singular contributions that we're looking for. So that's why, you know, very prominent scientists who have dominated the field for decades never get a Nobel Prize, because they didn't actually make improvement, not a lifetime achievement. And this is something that, you know, I think many people would, you know, that Nobel Prize are given out for lifetime achievements, but in fact they're not. Then we have this thing about the previous year that's in the will, right? And the way this is interpreted, if there is such an old discovery or improvement included in a prize, it's very often combined with a more recent contribution in the same field, so that we have this idea that it should be contemporary, not too old. And of course it should have wide scientific and or societal impact, and this goes back to this greatest benefit of kind. So if it has societal impact, obviously that's, you know, benefit for mankind. Scientific, well, that's also an interpretation that's developed over many years, that a groundbreaking basic science discovery can also be of great benefit for mankind, you know, in the future. So that's the criteria we try to apply. And as I said, the committee then finally every year makes a recommendation to the chemistry class in the academy. The class makes a recommendation to the academy, and the academy votes actually just hours before the announcement. So the same morning the academy convenes in the academy building, and the proposal is and there is a public vote, and this usually finishes about 1 to 2 hours before the announcement. So in the meantime, this famous phone, you know, to try to reach the laureates by phone before the official announcement is made, and it doesn't always work. I think sort of 2/3 of the time it works, but over time, you know, despite the fact that people have been at the academy have been researching phone numbers and trying to locate people in a very careful the weeks before, we don't always manage to get the person. But so sometimes they find out when the journalists start hunting them. But that's of course very nice moment to be there when the person is being told. You know, sometimes you can tell they thought this should have happened 10 years ago, and sometimes they're totally, you know, especially in cases where that this person actually did make regular contributions, but then maybe, you know, went to a different field or even went out of science altogether. So it happens then that somebody totally from the outside world, totally unexpected, and also personally totally unexpecting person actually is awarded, and that, you know, that's quite interesting, but it also sometimes it has dire consequences for that person, I'm afraid, because suddenly somebody, you know, gets elevated to Nobel status when they don't even have a very strong academic position or so, right? So, but it happens. Of course, there's a lot of work going on, you know, in preparing for this final announcement. So I should just say this is the press conference where the announcement is made. It's in this fancy room at the academy. You can't see it here, but this is actually a picture of Linnaeus, you know, who was one of the founders of the academy, in fact. So he has a prominent place here. So then you have all the news media here and television and so on, and the secretary of the academy and a couple of people from the committee then describe the prize and so on. So this is where it's official. Of course, there's a lot of press releases and stuff that has to be prepared beforehand. So there is a lot of work in the last month or so leading up to the announcement, which is done in deepest secrecy in a kind of a secluded room within the academy with computers that are not connected to internet, and so trying to produce all this written material that you can download from the websites and so on. And posters are produced and so on. And then comes December 10th, or the week leading up to December 10th, where of course the Nobel lectures is an important part, where the laureates give their lectures. And it's actually stipulated, I think, that you cannot get the prize unless you come and give a lecture. So nowadays that's not a problem to convince people to come, but in the early days this was actually not so easy. It was not easy to travel to Stockholm. It was middle of winter, who wants to go there in December 10th? And the prize, of course, wasn't so famous in those days. So they actually had to make a rule that in order to get the prize money, you have to come and give a lecture. And that's still a rule. So the lectures are held in our big lecture room at Stockholm University. And here you can see, this is last year's, this is Professor Higgs himself, when he is just going up to give his presentation last year. And then December 10th, the final task is to present the prize winners in Stockholm, and of course fancy and with the royal family and everything else. And this was the one year I presented the prize in 2006, I think, and I'm not very comfortable in tails, let's say that, but for this one time I'll do it. And of course the prize is handed out by the king and so on, and it's very, very solemn occasion. But of course there is one final thing, and that's the banquet. So the banquet is held in the City Hall of Stockholm, which is in fact a beautiful building, very different library here, but it's a beautiful grand party, and it's so from Swedish people, this is the Nobel Prize. When you ask a Swede about the Nobel Prize, this is what they will talk about, because it's on television. There's a lot of science. That's the Nobel Prize, but in Sweden it's come to be the party, and what people are wearing and all these things. So that's basically where 1 year ends and the next year begins for the committee. Although in fact for the committee, the year has ended. The committee hands out its report, and after that we start working on the next year's prize. So that's basically the end of the story. I just want to make one other thing, and that is that might be interesting for you in the future, is that the Nobel Foundation is very actively planning to build a new Nobel Center in central Stockholm. So there is a small museum today in Stockholm, but there is no real center for the Nobel activities. And so there was a architectural competition earlier this year, and there is now, this is the winning proposal, although it will be slightly different from what I show here. And the idea is that the prize ceremony will actually be held in this new center, and the foundation will be there, and there will be the museum will have much more space, and it's hopefully going to be a big attraction in Stockholm. There will be space for conferences and meetings and so on. So we hope that this will be really a center for science in the heart of Stockholm when this is eventually built. So if you come to Stockholm in, say, 2018, 2019 or something like that, then hopefully we'll have this building completed and the museum moved in and everything. And hopefully you'll also be able to see the room where the ceremony is going to be held in the future. So this is something that excites a lot of people now about the Nobel Prize. And here is, if you want to know more, I probably told you a lot more than what you really wanted to know about the Nobel Prize, but if still you want to know more, you can always go on the website and find out a lot more about the prize. So with that, I think I should finish, and thank you very much for giving me the occasion to come here.
Yes, thank you very much. It was a wonderful talk. I learned a lot about this. Two questions. One, you said that the academy decides, not the committee. But this means that the academy can change,
Yeah.
not follow the recommendation
Yes.
of the committee?
So it's happened a few times over history that the academy, in fact, has overruled what the committee and the section of chemistry has proposed, and actually came up with a different one. Those were back in the days when the media attention wasn't so high, so they didn't, I don't think they had press releases and things prepared. So it was a relatively easy change. Nowadays, if this were to happen, and it could happen, but if it were to happen, it would be a very difficult situation actually to handle the media and all this afterwards. But it can happen, definitely.
And who appoints, who named the committee? The academy, the members of the committee?
Yeah.
How are they appointed?
So it's in the case of chemistry, the section of chemistry in the academy proposes members of the committee to the academy, and the academy then decides. But basically, it's the chemistry section that decides on what the committee should look like, who should be on it, and you don't necessarily have to be a member of the academy to be a member of the committee, although in most cases, you are. But so I started on the committee half a year before I was elected to the academy. So.
And the last question, here in Mexico, the Mexican Academy of Sciences and other academies here and our university, we are interested in having the possibility of nominating some candidates. How do we do that if we are not invited? As you mentioned, you need to be invited. So if you are not in the list, we simply cannot nominate.
Yeah, so I don't think there is, so this is all regulated in the statutes of the Nobel Foundation, and I don't think that academies are, I'm not sure if academies are on that list, rotating list. But even if they were, it's not actually the academy that's asked to nominate, but it's individuals within the academy. And it even says in the letter, in the invitation letter, that you're not supposed to discuss this with anybody else. That if you do not make a nomination, you should not discuss it. It's you as an individual that make the nomination. It's not the university, it's not the academy, so on. So that's what I can say at this point. But sometimes we can tell that nominations are not from the individual, but they have been discussed, say, in the faculty or something. But that's not the idea. The idea is you should do it as an individual. You need to be invited through one of these categories that I showed you. But no matter how you're invited, whatever category you fall into, you're always invited as an individual. So if UNAM comes up on the list one year, it will be the professors at UNAM that are invited, and not UNAM as a body, right?
Well, welcome to Mexico. I'm glad that you give a wonderful talk, but I have one deep, troublesome question. It's a philosophical nature. I mean, you mentioned in the will that it says the most important discovery or improvement or whatever. Okay, but philosophically speaking, that's a very problematic point. I mean, it depends in the end on a certain values and criteria of a committee, a group of people. No matter it's well regulated and there are statutes and they respect it very well. But in the end, philosophically speaking, it's just a contingent fact. It's a decision of a committee of 3 or 4 members, as you mentioned. And how do you deal with this philosophical problem inside the committee? Thank you.
Well, I mean, in a philosophical sense, of course, any decision taken by humans is taken by humans, right? So, I mean, and it's clear that if there were a different set of people on the committee, they would come up with somewhat different decisions probably, or recommendations, let's say, in the end, right? Especially if, I think probably, you could have a number of permutations of the committee, that would probably come up with roughly the same list of what's the most important, current areas that we would think of in chemistry as being, good areas for the prize. But what would be different between the committees, I think, first of all, maybe they would come up with slightly different names if you take a given area, but probably not too different. But what would probably be more different is, the final decision. So say we have four areas in a given year that we think we could in principle go with any of these four, and we know which people we want to put on the prize if we go with 1, 2, or 3, or 4. But then which of the four to pick, that's where it would make, it could be quite a big difference, I think, depending on exactly who's on the committee. Not that people are defending their own fields. This committee becomes like your family, right? So it's not, you trust each other, and it's not, I can be equally excited about something from organic chemistry or wherever as from biochemistry. But so that's not really an issue, but just the individuals, what excites me more, this or that. And if the committee was a somewhat different set of people, a given year we would, chances are we'd come up with a different pick from the top, the top candidates.
The Nobel Prize is not awarded post-mortem. Does this come from the will or from the statutes?
I think this comes from the statutes, actually, I believe. Normally it's not. And it has actually been broken. I think in literature it's been broken once, intentionally. I mean, it was given to somebody who everybody knew was dead at the time, right? But you remember a couple of years ago in medicine, the person actually died the night before the vote was held, right? But nobody knew. And that was big. That really created quite an issue. And they had to call in the best legal expertise on very short notice. They basically had a day to decide, whether it was an invalid decision or whether they could uphold the decision. And in the end, the legal advice was that you can uphold the decision because nobody knew in the committee or this was the Karolinska Institute, so nobody knew that the person had died the night before. But that was a really close call, I think. Had the person died another day earlier, probably the information would have, made it to Stockholm, and then they could not have done it. So, yeah. Probably not, yeah.
How close can a candidate from Latin America can be through the years you have election process?
Oh yeah, well, it's something I could not answer. You're right. Yes. But you can go back in 50 years' time. You can go back and look at our protocols and and what we've been doing. So it's when we travel and when we meet people, we're very happy to take receive suggestions and advice and things we should think about, but we're never going to make any we're never going to comment back. We're just absorbing things. We're not giving things back in these situations. But it's always very interesting to hear what people think. But I will not make any comments. That's the hard part. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's very interesting also to know how much you can tell.
Yeah, and the idea, basically nothing.
Thank you. Thank you.
I think that's the only way to approach this, is basically to say nothing outside of the committee. So otherwise you're on a slippery slope.